everybody. Welcome to our Container Expert Series. Today we have Maddie Stratton, Peter Van Nordenen, and Martin Wimpress to talk about collaborative risk management. So we're going to be digging into the disconnect we sometimes feel between developers and security teams and what they can do together to act more effectively as one when confronted with security threats. So just to introduce who our speakers are on the call, Peter is our Senior Director of Growth here at Slim.AI. He was previously a product manager for TripAdvisor, working with both the platform and the feature teams. And prior to that, he was a technology journalist. Martin is our Senior Director of Developer Relations and Community here at Slim. And he was previously a vulnerability analyst and an information security risk manager. And finally, Maddie is the Director of Development Relations at Avon, a well-known member of the DevOps community, a founder and co-host of the popular Arrested DevOps podcast, and he's the global chair of the DevOps Days conferences. So he has more than 20 years of experience in IT ops. I'm Ann James. I'm on the design partner growth team for Slim.AI. So yeah, thanks for everyone for being here. We're really excited to have your participation in this session. We hope it will be interactive. So to that end, we're going to have a poll coming up to keep things lively, and we'll also have plenty of time to ask and answer questions. So if we don't answer them during the session, we'll definitely get to them at the end of the call. We've left some time for Q&A then. So just some quick housekeeping for anybody who might not be familiar with Zoom webinars. You're going to see a Q&A panel kind of at the bottom of your Zoom window. So feel free to put your questions in there or in the chat. We'll keep an eye on both, and we'll be sure to get to them. When a live poll is happening, you're going to see a poll pop up here, and you'll have multiple choice options. So with that, I think that's all of our housekeeping. So I'm going to hide here, and without further ado, I'll hand it off to Maddie to get us started.
All right, great. Yeah. Well, I had my little introduction place here, but then Ann already introduced me, so you don't need to sit and stare at this. But I'm really excited to have this conversation, and especially kind of thinking, we were talking before about everyone's different background. So I come primarily from an operations background. I say, I worked in technology operations for a couple decades, and now they pay me to talk about it. But I've also had the chance to talk to organizations all over the world about how they're doing DevOps, and now also, this DevSecOps kind of thing. And then, Martin coming from a security background, and a lot of this is figuring out, how do we collaborate? How do we work together? Because ultimately, we're all really trying to accomplish similar things. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges we see, and we've seen for how many years in the DevOps space and moving into this, is how do we move our conversation away from the thing that matters to me in my role, like what I would call like a micro incentive or a micro goal, versus kind of the macro incentive of like, what does the organization want to do? And kind of thinking about that briefly, the context I kind of usually think about it is when we're looking at the classic dev and ops, and this will play into security as well. And we think about what is the goal, right? Like, and if you think about your, how do you know you're a good feature developer? Well, you ship a lot of new changes, right? You make a lot of changes, you ship new features. Well, I come from I was a sysadmin and everything. I was doing my job if the system was stable and we didn't have downtime. Well, those two things can be at odds with each other, because what's one of the things that tends to introduce downtime is a change, right? First thing we do when we have an issue, what do we usually say? What changed? And then but the difference is sorry. So it sounds like we want different things, but ultimately what we want to do is help the company sell shoes, provided that we sell shoes. I mean, at TripAdvisor for Peter, probably that would have been a secondary goal, maybe.
Sell hotels,
galoshes, yeah. I don't know. And I always think about this. I had a colleague when I was running technology operations for apartments.com, and we had a sister company that was in real estate. And my equivalent, the tech ops director at HomeFinder, her annual bonus was a percentage of uptime of the website. So they sat there and they said, like, okay, we're going to pay you $10,000 times the uptime. How many changes do you think she would ever allow through, right? Because those all came in. And then we run into the same thing with security, right? We sort of sit there and we get our very narrow view because of what our way of rewarding or a way of understanding our job is, but really we're trying to enable our business. So again, this goes back into our thought about collaboration. So I think going to our poll, maybe one of the first things, we got a couple poll questions that Ann will throw, but one of them we wanted to sort of, actually, I don't know which one you're doing first, Ann, so I guess we'll find out. There we go. So we'll talk about the collaboration. So in your experience, do you think is it getting better? Is it getting worse? Or is it, as my Gen Z children would say, is it mid? Is it neither better nor worse? It's just mid. So go ahead and we'll throw a vote up there. This is very scientific too. We'll be creating an official report, peer reviewed and everything based on this. So, don't lie, because we can tell.
Manny, I can jump in just for 1 second on that. I think one interesting insight, just to double click on what you just said, is that there's actually major business implications to this. So coming at it from like the product management lens, like at TripAdvisor, right, we were only as good as the number of tests that we could send out. We were constantly doing A/B tests, sell hotels, sell attractions, sell restaurants, and we were only as good as our ability to ship those tests. And the more we could ship, the more wins we would find. And the more wins we found, the better our bottom line was at the end of the day. So as we go into like 2023, with the economy looking like it is, every business is going to be looking for advantages. Now, in an ideal world, you would never ship anything that was insecure. You would never ship anything that presented any risk to sort of downtime, like you said, and all of that. But that's not the business reality that we live in. We have to ship new features. We have to continue building new things that customers want. And to do that, you're automatically sort of taking on this risk from the security standpoint. So I think these issues only get like more pressing when you look at like developer velocity and sort of the business outcomes that it unlocks. Of course, nobody wants to ship anything insecure or be responsible for a security breach. So it's all about finding that right balance for your organization and how your organization responds when something does go wrong.
Yeah, and just to add to that, in my prior roles, part of the trick of implementing that is not just developer velocity and having good practice around, these days, your container composition, but how do you actually test and assess the deployed application to ensure that the momentum you have in your iterative development processes as you introduce new features aren't introducing new exposure and security attack surface and vulnerabilities? And balancing that can be challenging. And how do you approach that these days, and who do you engage to do that work?
I'm looking at the results of the poll, and we are very evenly split. So we have come with no conclusion here. It is inconclusive, similar to maybe some things happening in U.S. politics right now. So, which is fine. I think one of the things too that comes, and last sort of thought on this before we move into the next one is, a lot of times I'll sit when I'm talking to an organization, people in an organization, developers, operations. So I said, do you know how your company makes money? If not, go find out. I'll wait. And what I mean by that is, because the thing that's interesting is usually we don't. Like, we think we know, but we don't know what's the actual. Again, Peter talked about like the business metrics or the business outcomes. One thing I found really interesting, I spent a bunch of time working in the public sector when I was at Red Hat, working with state and local government, and public sector employees actually know that answer really well. And the answer isn't, because you don't ask them, how do you make money? Because they don't. But the equivalent in public sector is, what's the mission? What's the point of the Texas Workforce? What do you do? And they know that. But then you go into a commercial enterprise and they'll say, well, we make money doing this. And you're like, but you don't. And the example I would give is like when I worked at apartments.com, the way apartments.com made money was with leads. Like Peter talked about, you had to run these tests. So it was providing leads. And so then what's the most important metric. And the reason I bring this up is you want to know what is your key business metric. And examples of that, like Netflix, their key business metric is stream starts per second, right? Amazon, not AWS, but regular Amazon is like average cart size. PagerDuty, when I worked there, it was notification delay. And those are the ones that, because number one, they're tied, their business metrics are tied to the revenue, right? Like that's a thing. And that if something is affecting that number, that's a thing to watch out for. So same thing, whether it's secure, and that's what lets you do. We talk a lot about doing risk assessment and cost benefit analysis. Well, you can probably figure out that you need to be able to know those numbers so you can quantify the cost and the benefit, which can say, okay, if I am going to take risk, because like Peter said, sometimes we have to take some risk. Is the risk worth okay, we'll do this? Or you'd be like, okay, we're going to take this big risk and it's going to like get us like 5 more leads. Okay, well, it's probably not worth it. So, and going into that, we talked about, we're all coming from different backgrounds. I think we have another poll, just out of curiosity, would love to see like how people in your regular role today, like how do you, what part of the business, part of the organization are you most closely connected to? Whether it's development, security, operations, et cetera. I don't remember what the choices were. So I guess we'll find out in a minute.
Yeah, and if it is it depends, then we'd love to hear more in the chat, because it just feels
Yeah.
like organizations are really being innovative in the way they kind of put developers with security, with platform, with site reliability engineering. It's just really interesting to hear the way organizations are kind of moving and shifting to to meet the moment here. So,
and it's increasingly likely that some of you are wearing multiple hats, just depending on what you happen to be doing in that hour of the day. We saw, dev and ops get smashed together some years ago, and then DevSec and ops got smashed together as well. And not always are those roles distinguished by the individuals performing the function.
Mm-hmm. I feel like multiple hats is going to be the
Yeah,
yeah.
I feel
the front runner there.
Yeah, I have a good feeling on that one.
I was going to say, if any of you who are checking anything other than multiple hats, that sounds like a great place to work.
Yeah. I was going to say we found the startup people, right? But I guess it's true of any size of organization these days. But
the poll that's missing from this is, what were you hired to do?
Yeah,
right,
what are you
right,
actually?
right.
What
did you think
doing?
your job was going to be when you started? What does it actually turned out to be? That's a whole other episode conversation. The connection of that. Excuse me. And you can tell it's winter.
Yes. Yeah, Maddie, I think one of the things that was resonating to me as you were talking about is sort of, like I'm fairly new to the DevOps space. So I was working in product management, big travel company before that, technology before that. And so in kind of like encountering things like the Phoenix Project, and the sort of fundamental books about DevOps, there was sort of this picture of like the CISO with the binder full of policies, and they're walking around the organization and saying like, no, you can't do that. No, you can't do that. No, you need to check this box, and it feels like that's really given way to this sort of like new CISO that's out there, right? Who is like very much about developer velocity. I know we have an advisor on our board that we talk to a lot, who's a CISO at a large company, and he's really goaled himself, back to your kind of like business outcome goals. He really goals himself on things like how fast do new features ship, how many new tests are we running, stuff like that, which is a really interesting thing. It's not necessarily even, he has to be accountable for all of these security outcomes, but he's aligned himself to the business in a way that I think is really interesting. So I wonder if you've heard from other people that's, is that an old trend at this point? Is that companies are still trying to adopt this sort of new world of DevSecOps? Like, I'm wondering what you're hearing out there in terms of how people are adopting that mind frame.
I think there's a lot of desire to get to that business, and I think the same thing that we're seeing around the changes in the CISO's office is the same thing we were seeing in the chases of the VP of infrastructure. But where your problem runs into, you can have these ideas up at the ELT side that this is what we're going to do. And this is true of any kind of transformation like this. Your problem is always what we would call the frozen middle, right? So you've got, so in this case of, InfoSec and that, your CISO is saying like, yes, you know what? I'm going to sit and I'm aligned to my pal, the CFO and the chief revenue officer and the CTO and all this stuff. And your practitioners, actually, even your, security analysts, they're like, cool, I get this. And then you've got sort of your folks in the middle who are still, though, connected to how they're used to doing work. And probably there's still some incentives that haven't been fixed yet.
Yeah.
Right. And this is just the challenge you have. The larger the organization, the slower it is to move and change. And especially around security. But I think in general, in tech, we're getting better and we're seeing more of being aligned to business outcomes, which is super helpful. But again, it still goes back to that, like, okay, this is how I understand how to do this. And I'll give you, I think it comes up especially in security because it's such a I don't want to say formalized, but it's compliance, literal. And I always talk about the difference between capital C and lowercase c compliance, right? You have your organizational compliance, but sometimes you have capital C compliance. You have actual PCI, Sarbanes-Oxley, whatnot. But what's interesting, and this was is how often, and Martin, I'd be interested, in your experience. I try to not come preloaded with my history of an ops person and security that I've worked with. Is there's often a disconnect and a dissonance between understanding what is actually in the regulation and what is our company's historical implementation of the regulation.
Right.
So there'll be things that say, no, we can't do that because of PCI. And it's like, no, that's actually not the case. But the way that this control with the difference between the control, what the actual control is, and the control's implementation. And so I'm curious too, also what you've seen is that getting better of an understanding, or
So definitely, it was some years ago now, but I think I lived through that sort of transition of the risk management team, which I was a part of, having the control to say something did or didn't happen. And it was very much a regimented process. We could go through literally a tick box exercise to say whether something happened or not. And we definitely hit a friction point there where business momentum was being held up by what was seen to be too rigid and inflexible security policies. And that's where the information risk management piece came in. And as you say, you can't always just say no because security, you have to right size that risk. And sometimes you have to take on a bit of risk in order to fulfill a business objective. But what we worked towards was, well, how can we provide better tools to the development teams in order that they know what the criteria are, and us to help them through that process. And I suppose that was the first time that those two teams that were at odds with each other actually came together with meaningful collaboration, where now the information risk security team weren't saying, no, you can't do this because of FIPS or whatever it might be. Yes, you can do it. And these are the tools that can help you achieve the outcome that we're looking for. And so that was some time ago. And I still see, anecdotally from my peers in the industry, that some of that friction still exists, where the security teams are separate from the dev teams, and there is a little bit of conflict there. And I think it definitely works better when those teams are more closely aligned and have the same business priorities and objectives.
Just to jump in on sorry, just on that point real quick. Our colleague Aisha will be in the next webinar. So people who are joining for the third one, Aisha will be sharing a bit there. And one of the findings she found in some polling she was doing of a bunch of organizations is to what you said, Maddie, about that frozen middle, and what Martin was alluding to, which is like the tool set, right, that people have is not always there. So in our poll, 49% of executives polled said that their teams have the tools that they need to secure their containers for production. Only 31% of the practitioners of the frontline employees said the same thing. So there's this disconnect. The executives are saying, yeah, we're good, we got it figured out, although not all of them, only 49%. But the frontline employees don't always see the same picture because they're seeing it kind of day to day.
Yeah, I like to talk about the idea of work as imagined versus work as done, and that's that's a fairly typical outcome of what happens, right? And we talk in resilience engineering space, we talk about the difference between the folks at the blunt end and the folks at the sharp end. And the folks at the sharp end are the ones who actually really understand how things are happening because they're in the systems, and that's why you get to that enablement. We're going to talk about the collaboration a little bit more in a minute, but I do want to say I believe really strongly, I always say, in democratizing your security testing, right, and your ability, because you can't, number one, this is what shift left really means. It doesn't mean like dump all the work on everybody towards the left, but it's start thinking about this stuff earlier, thinking around, sort of trust but verify. But I had this slide in a talk for a while ago that was sort of the Batman slapping Robin. And it was like, basically I said, don't be a jerk. Don't put tests in your pipeline that a developer can't run locally, because that's really mean, right? To be like, okay, the only way I can go all the way along this process, and then you're going to reject me. And I had no way of even knowing that. And the reason, and this is the thing that I think is really good about where we are in the tooling space, when I think about this versus even 5 or 6 years ago, is if you went to an organization 5 or 6 years ago and said, give vuln scanning ability to all of your developers, they would be like, with what money? Because you had tools that were $15,000 a seat.
Right.
So you're not going to do that. You're only going to let a few people do it. And it's going to, by virtue, it's going to become a bottleneck and become a funnel. And so by creating more, being able to leverage more open source tooling, more automated tooling, that's really helped with that quite a bit. So a couple thoughts to go into as we kind of move into our conversation. And again, as we said, feel free if you've got ideas or thoughts or questions, we'll take them as we go. So you can answer this in your head or answer it in the chat. But, for you folks I hesitate to even say audience, we're all participating. We're participants. People tuning in. What are some of the challenges that you've seen between security and development or feature teams in your organization? That's one to sort of think about. Like I said, you can answer it in your head. You can answer it out loud. You're not on mic. Maybe you tell your dog. And the other part of that is, what are the opportunities? This is the beginning of a new year, right? So I hate to say our New Year resolution, because New Year resolutions, they are always done by today, by the 5th, they're over. But what are the opportunities that you want to see between your security teams, your development teams, your infrastructure teams, and your organization? Like some of those things you're looking for when that comes in. So we're going to talk about a couple different scenarios that might happen and how the different teams could work together on this. So one is sort of this, I like to see, is not today 0 day, which you can either make that a Saturday Night Live reference or a Game of Thrones reference, whichever one works for you. What do we say to the 0 day, the God of 0 days? Not today. And so you could see here in this scenario, like you'd say, hey, oh crap, we found a 0 day bug that's been sitting there for like 60 days. So it's not even really a 0 day for us anymore, right? It's a 2 month a day. And then, so, got, security analyst says, this is this thing that's been existing since basically the beginning of computing time and time itself that we designed and implemented, and it's been sitting out there. And what are we going to do? So this is a 0 day. So the first thing is, when we think about this, we identified the 0 day, kind of what are the ways that those might come in, and Martin, you come from that background a little bit more, but like, how would we see that coming across our desk, really?
In some cases, it's going to be something that's just been released from embargo. Yep. So it's a CVE. And in other cases, you will have run one of your regular assessments or audits against your own, usually, not the production infrastructure, but some analog infrastructure that represents production. And you've run your full battery of vulnerability assessment tools, and you find something new. And the first thing you need to do is, well, as I was saying earlier, right size the response. So you use something like CVSS in order to determine what exposure do you have, and therefore what is an appropriate response. Is it stop the line and everyone needs to focus on this, or is it put together a small virtual team and work on this diligently and at the appropriate pace? So it's identify, understand, and prioritize.
And I think this is one of those things, to right size it is why you need to have input from beyond just your security team, because understanding the impact, you need to have someone from your products, your customer side, who understands, okay, we can sit there and we have to be able to quantify the number of customers impacted, for example, if that's the case, how much potential impact there is. And then likewise, you need, from a deployment perspective of fixing it, like, how big of a deal is that going to be, so that we can do them back? And it's not supposed to be one of those like, okay, well, it's only going to impact this much and be too much work to do, but at least to set the proper expectation. I don't think you would right size this to say like, well, we don't have to do anything about it at all. But to Martin's point, is this something where we really have to like muster as much as possible? Because if we don't, we're losing, customers are losing, €1 million a minute. Or is this, okay, we don't necessarily have to like pull people out of bed at 2 a.m. for this. We can adjust it. We can start this at 8 tomorrow. I think this also gets this is all just telling a story towards collaboration, because it's going to come into, talking to your folks from a legal perspective, especially if you're multinational, right? Because your compliance requirements, we talked about this a little bit before too, because on the implementation side, we may not have a full understanding of the actual regulation. We tend to have a really good understanding of our implementation of that regulation, right? Which usually in most organizations is a little more conservative than the actual one. At least if you're creating your policy, that's my recommendation, because you want, same thing where if we're going to talk SRE terms, you want your SLO to be tighter than your SLA, right? You want to be alerted before you're in violation of a contract. So similarly, we want to say our expected remediation should be a little more aggressive than what is the thing that's going to get us fined. And one of the things I think is interesting with this collaboration part is there's two parts of your organization that use similar terms for a lot of things, and they tend to be your ops folks and your infosec folks. And we all do incident response. And what's interesting is how, at least in my experience, and I spent many years working at PagerDuty with lots of customers, how these two organizations run completely different processes that have nothing to do with each other, when fundamentally they are exactly the same. And that's one of my little bits of advice would be looking at this is when you're looking at incident response, your SREs, your ops folks, hopefully your devs too, if you're by the way, put devs on call, also pay people to be on call. Those are two important things. You're going to have a process, right? For incident response, you have your incident commander, you have your way you do all this stuff, and your security analysts and security folks, they have one too. And they should be the same. Doesn't mean you have the same incident, doesn't mean the same people participating, but the process should be so that the reason that matters is because this is collaborative. You want the ability to pull people in and out of both, right? So a process can start, and this is a little bit of a spoiler for the next story we're going to tell, can start looking like it's not a security thing. It can look just like it's a regular ops thing, and it could become a security incident. And you want to be able to move it into that without losing momentum, and also have all the people, your responders should all know how it works. It shouldn't be, oh, wait a minute, we do things differently if it's security than if it's, a bug fix or whatnot. It's too much cognitive overload.
Yeah. And I think, Maddie, like you're alluding to something that's like so true about like 0-day vulnerabilities, right? Which is that a lot of your success in the response is based on the work you do before it ever happens, right? Which is, we talked a lot in the previous webinar about kind of SBOMs and creating sort of, a record of your software, knowing what's in your software. Well, right, like that's like the first step in addressing a 0-day vulnerability, which is like, where is this thing? Like where is it running in my infrastructure? And can I find that information quickly? Now, you don't want to start that process when you're looking for Log4j. You want to start that process now and know that, you can go find the libraries, packages, files that are running in your infrastructure, know where they are, know what versions you're on, and all of that kind of stuff. That's the why behind SBOMs. I think if you look at the government response, they did kind of a retrospective on Log4j, and they estimated that like two things made a big difference in the response to Log4j. One was having a record of the software, having SBOMs generated. People were generally more successful, and that cut out a lot of time in the process. The second was collaboration, like you're talking about internally, but also externally, the community talking to itself. So I think the thing I would add to this is actually there's usually a lot of different spots externally when a 0-day is happening. My experience with Log4j, I was kind of following along with it, and it actually started, it was discovered in Minecraft, which is like really interesting. It was a Minecraft server that first saw the bug. And we do a lot of work with containers in Minecraft because it's just kind of fun. Martin and I like play around with it, and you can slim a Minecraft container. So I dropped into that community, and that community was actually like a really good resource for Log4j information because they were trying to patch it in the Minecraft servers that they had, which is just their hobby project, but all of them were following along everything that was coming out of Apache, everything that was coming out of the government. So you found a lot of information there. So there's always a lot of valuable information outside in the community as well. So it's important to collaborate like externally when these things are happening and not just internally.
Yeah, I'd just like to emphasize how important that point Pete's made regarding the due diligence you can do beforehand that can save you significant time in the way that you respond as an organization. And if you haven't done the due diligence up front, that's not to say that you should respond in a chaotic way. When you see all of the alarms go off and all of the traffic lights go red, don't panic. It's important that you actually have the right data to understand the nature of the problem that you're dealing with. So it's always worth spending more time to understand the nature of what you're responding to and what needs to be done, and also what else you need to understand in order to respond appropriately. It's okay to get to the point where you say, we need more information about this before we can make a good decision on how we proceed. Being prepared, even if it's at the point you know you have a problem, it's always better to get good information early and upfront rather than be chaotic in your response. And it's just a golden rule. But yeah, Pete's right. If you do it up front, it's always going to go better for you. And if you have a consistent playbook that everyone's responding with, playing by, then that is also essential.
I'll share it later. I have a talk that I've given. I've kind of retired, but I gave for a long time, and it was about basically practicing incident response. And what it has to do with is how we set ourselves in our the physiological part of us, because these are high stress situations, and this is why you practice. And you don't practice, you practice so that you create an association of calm. This is one of the things. So this is my little bit. People will say, oh, if we're going to run a failure Friday or a test, don't tell the people practicing what the issue is. I'm like, no, because the point of doing a practice is not to practice troubleshooting. You get plenty of practice at that, don't worry. The point of it is to get it into your muscle memory of, this is just what we do. Okay, cool. Because you also don't want to have the first time you have to log into PagerDuty in the last 6 months be when there was an incident, and try to remember how you do it. So the more that we just treat these things as regular day to day, there's, again, you don't have to, this is the thing, my bit of advice, if you're going to talk about practicing incident response, you do not need to practice putting your people under stress. They get plenty of stress practice. You actually want to do the opposite, is make it as normalized as possible. And also, Peter, really good callback. We talked earlier about how I spent the last I asked the last hour mitigating a resource allocation problem between my two 13-year-olds fighting over the Xbox. And as it happens, they're fighting over playing Minecraft. So it all connects when it comes to that. We will be doing I will be doing a retrospective with them.
Minecraft is just a really good starting place for anything that you're doing in DevOps. I think it's just a really good. That's the lesson there.
Just to build on what you've said there, Matty. One of the organizations I was working for when I was doing InfoSec and vulnerability analysis and what have you was an aviation organization. And our business was analyzing the data that comes off the black box flight recorders for the aircraft. And one of the things we found extremely useful was not just learning from the pilots in terms of what we needed to analyze in the data from their aircraft, but also looking at their safety and training discipline and implementing that in the way that we ran our DevOps teams, because we made sure we never had single mode failure for our server architecture, something we learned from the way that commercial aviation aircraft are, built, designed to not have multiple single modes of failure. But also their training is constantly training for disastrous outcomes. And so we implemented, very routine, let's simulate a bad outcome and deal with it. And that was an essential part to when things didn't go well, like the epoxy resin melts in the firewall on Christmas Day, how do we respond and recover from that? Or when we find out we think we've had a breach and it's actually an unauthorized penetration test being run against our infrastructure, being prepared for that stuff and knowing where to go and to get the data was vital. And we learned that from an industry that has an impeccable safety record and has learned well how to learn from sort of mistakes and accidents and build in discipline around avoiding those things happening again in the future.
I want to call Seth made a comment in the chat and said, they started their software developer career in defense contracting, and just sort of the nature of that work, right, is everyone is very security conscious, no matter what your job is. And everyone pays attention to it. It's built in the culture. And they said they went to work in commercial companies, and security was something that devs were like, it's somebody else's problem. I don't have to worry about that. But I think what's interesting here is they say when it was part of the culture, the impact of the work was expected and accounted for. You're always thinking about it. If it's external to your job, then it's a burden, and it's a blocker, it's an obstacle, and it's an adverse impact to velocity. My friend Julian Dunn, formerly of Chef and various other places, has always said security is just another aspect of quality. And there's a lot of stuff I would say, if you were doing software development and said, we're not going to do any testing until the last sprint, that would sound ridiculous, right? I mean, there are organizations that do that, but they don't do very well. But yet it's not uncommon in a lot of organizations, even today, to have a hardening sprint, right? Which is, we do all this work for several months, and then the last thing before it goes, now is the time that we will start looking at security. And this is when you have the thing, because the reason you have to do that is you don't have democratized security, you don't have the enablement of it. So the only people who can do that work are a small set of people, where that goes. And then what do you run into, right? So what's going to happen? Well, if you don't pass, are you going to stop the release? Well, no, because you've got commitments. So you're going to get an exception. And, the bad guys on the internet don't care that you have a note from security saying it was okay, so that's a thought. Yeah.
No, we can go on to the next one then, because I think
Yeah.
it'll come up in the next one. But I just wanted to plus one that one. When I was at TripAdvisor, I'll say like the security teams were so good there. It was like you almost didn't even know it had shifted so far to the left that all of our developers were thinking about security all the time. And as a product manager, somebody looking to get features out the door, we actually really didn't have to think about it that much, because the processes, the culture was there. So I think that's a great point by Seth. Like if you're in a place where the culture is that security is a suck to velocity, then they're probably, that probably is a good indicator that maybe something isn't tuned as well as it could be. I think that's a great call out.
So this other one, this is we sort of have talked about this actually quite a bit already, so we might do this one a little bit quicker. This is really that, like, we have an incident and we don't know if it's security related. Maybe it starts out as, okay, it's we're seeing something look squirrely for some reason. Maybe it's coming in through SRE originally. And when we sort of think through that path, what I'd like you who you're watching, when you think through this, depending on which hat you are mostly wearing or where your responsibilities go, kind of how does that happen if you have an incident that starts out as an uptime incident, it starts out as a service incident that maybe is determined to be security. Like how is that happening? Or vice versa, something comes in, it looks like it's security and maybe it's not, because that can also happen too, right? I think one of the things when we think about these places is when you have those roles, and there's a pretty common approach. And if you're interested in good practice around this, the good folks at PagerDuty have sort of open sourced a bunch of practices around the incident command system, and where this goes. And I'm not a big, I don't, people get resistant to certain terminologies, although in the security side, people seem to like a lot of the military terms, but sometimes people push back on incident commander. But the point is, you need to have someone who's not involved in the troubleshooting or in the work, who's actually just managing the decision-making. And where this comes in, I think it's just one of the big challenging things with this is that incident commander is the highest authority on the call. And that means they outrank everybody, even the CEO. Now, if you're going to follow this, my advice to you is don't test this during an incident. Prepare your executive teams for this. But there was actually a literal an example that so the current CEO of PagerDuty, Jen Tejada, who's been there for years and is amazing. A couple months after she started, there was an incident and she got on the incident call, and the incident commander at a certain point asked her to leave. And she, was surprising and stuff. And, the other executives, went there and said, no, that's how it works. right? That's the now, but the reason for that is because, like Martin said, there's a lot of different things happening, and you want to be able to, we talked about, from a day-to-day perspective, you want to think about the big picture, but when you're on an incident, you need to be able to be hyper focused on the one thing you're trying to do right there, right? So if you say, hey, Peter, I need you to go check this one thing out, you need to not be trying to field questions and then be like, oh, wait, I wonder about this customer or whatnot. We want to be able to be really contained in that. And then also have that incident commander as the person who can be able to know how to bring in those other people, which sit there and say, okay, so, Martin was on this call too, and he's like, ooh, I think we need to bring in the security analyst. Martin doesn't have to go do that, right? He can just say, I think we need that. And the incident commander will handle all those pieces and parts. And so, Peter, I'm curious, because, you come from on the product side, what's been your experience? Because different places have done this, and you're, as a product person, your involvement in actual incident response, if at all. I didn't know how they did that at TripAdvisor. So
yeah, it's usually me sitting at a desk behind a bunch of important people, like talking to each other, and me kind of like looking over, being like, what do you guys, is this gonna affect my feature launch? But no, I think you're right. I mean, I think like the points I would add would be, I think like in today's distributed environments, having like some sort of cultural norms around like Slack, whether you're using Slack or Discord or whatever, that was something that we did really well at TripAdvisor. I think anytime there was an incident, you could spin up a Slack room, get all the right people in it immediately, tag people in. And so, sometimes it would come down to this, like, I remember a few big incidents that we dealt with. They were mostly on the ops side, on the kind of reliability side. When TripAdvisor went down, we were losing, millions of dollars a minute or whatever the case was, depending on the time of day. But, but being able to just rally people quickly into Slack and say like, hey, this is what we're seeing, blah, blah, blah. And I would even add that like having a system of record for the changes, that's something we're seeing at Slim.AI, which is, it goes to SBOMs and that, and having sort of a record in your CI/CD system. Every new build that you do, you have a record. Okay, this version got bumped from this to this, so that could be the root cause of what happened. Or we actually got this new library that got added to the system. Okay, let's make sure that that's happened. But oftentimes your containers are changing underneath you, and you don't even necessarily know if a base image is changing or some dependency library that's kind of chained 3 dependencies back might be changing, and you might not know. So again, kind of having that system of record, having like a log of everything that's changed, and being able to access that information quickly, I think is a great point in this. Is that an ops problem is a problem? Well, we don't know until we kind of get down to the root cause, and let's make sure we have the information and the communication pathways to do that.
And I think that goes back to that proactivity of being in front of it, because the first thing you usually do in an incident is you're trying to get a bunch of information. And so this is going a little bit into an opinion about, the AI function of like, AI ops and everything and auto remediation. And I'm like, no, I think what the automation can be really helpful is doing the things you always do. And I don't mean as simple as like, oh, we have this problem, we always restart Apache. But I sit there and I'm like, okay, normally what would happen if I get paged, the first thing I'm going to do when I get on a terminal is I'm going to pull up this logs, or I'm going to go and I'm going to look at the manifest of the container, or doing that kind of thing. It'd be really great if that could already be happening in the time between that, or if it doesn't have to happen at all because I already have that in a system of record, as long as that is trustable. So because that's the other thing too, we run into it. It's like, is it constantly running? Is it something? And that goes back to a bigger thing. Like so much of this, the whole point is your incident is made a lot happier by the work you do in advance. And having a consistent way that you do all of your changes, even during an incident, right? And this is sort of the thing, because you need to have a similar process for emergency and expedited things, because also if you have a way that shortcuts things when it's an emergency, then guess what? Everything's an emergency. That's a whole other problem. But then because you make these changes, you don't know. But if we say, okay, cool, the only difference is maybe not as many people have to say it's okay, but it's still doing that way. Mark Burgess has said in the past, every time someone logs interactively into a system, they compromise everybody's understanding of the system. So if the way we deploy changes is through rebuilding the container, then that's the way we always do it, right? But we have to do it through the way that it's tracked, because we did touch it. And then the more information, the better, right?
Yeah, I think there's some really important points there. So you talked earlier about having your incident commander, or what we used to call the incident coordinator, not be from the C-suite. Well, all of this upfront preparation that Pete's identified is critical in keeping the C-suite out of the decision-making process, because the sooner that you can provide them answers to questions that they're going to have, and as soon as you can instill some confidence in that group of people that you've got a handle on this and you know what you're dealing with, then the less likely it is that they're going to want to be involved, because they see that, you know, the right people have got their hand on the tiller. And again, similarly, one of the things we learned from the aviation industry is human factors. And whilst you may have multiple people in your organization who could be your incident commander stroke coordinator, you should only ever have one nominated incident coordinator at any one time. If because of the time of day they need to rotate out, they can hand over to somebody else who will pick up, but there is only one IC at any given time. And we learned this because if you've got two captains at the front of an aircraft, you are most likely to have a disastrous outcome, because they won't concede to one another easily. This is why you have a first officer and a captain flying aircraft. And the same reason you don't have two people with the same authority, the same final say decision-making authority, because it leads to conflict, confusion, and slows down momentum.
Yeah, and
Oh,
I know that. Oh yeah,
I
no,
just
go
dropped
ahead.
in the chat a link to that incident response guide from PagerDuty, which actually also includes some training, free training materials that covers a lot of this kind of stuff. It actually has nothing to, you don't have to use PagerDuty to do this. This is, and it's based on how PagerDuty themselves actually do incident response. But go ahead.
Cool. Well, no, I'll move us on. I wanted to plus one that thought, but yeah, we have one more scenario. If people do have questions, feel free to drop your questions in. We're happy to get to them. We are going to stop right at 2. So, but Anne just dropped the link to our Discord in the chat as well. So if you're not in our Discord already for Slim.AI, please drop in. You know, we can answer questions and chat there as well.
So yeah, I think the last scenario is not the reactive, but it's really that proactive. We talked about, you know, we need to get new features out there. How do we, this goes into that idea of quote shifting left, which my problem with that term is that it's nuanced, and nuance is not expressed in a couple words, but we do have to have a short phrase, because otherwise every time we refer to it, it's, you know, let me give you a paragraph of thoughts. But when we sort of think about this idea, so first of all, to kind of cut to that, when we talk about shifting left, like I said, it's not a matter of, and again, the sort of left is, you have to sort of think about it from the, it's like a delivery pipeline, right? Starting with, you know, the person creating the code, it's sort of moving along through its steps from left to right as it goes. We're not taking the work that's usually done at the right and throwing it on the people that are on the left, right? Which is maybe that some folks in your organization might want to do that, you know, do more with less kind of thing, but that's not helpful. We're saying we're taking the effort and the idea and the thought. So we're involving people, because you still need to have, the same thing is true in operations as it's true in info, you know, security. These are domain expertise, right? DevOps was not about making developers experts in web operations, right? That was a thing called no ops, and there's a reason it's not around, right? But we're saying, okay, operations is a skill, right? It's a specialty. Security is a specialty. Does that mean that people writing code throw their hands up, as Cesar said, and be like, well, it's not my thing? No, it's saying, okay, this is everyone's job, but it's not your job to be a super expert in it. We want to be able to move things towards that. And I think, again, talking about the democratizing that, right? We think about, it all goes back to security as an aspect of quality, right? Where is the cheapest and easiest way to fix a bug? And it's closest to its introduction, right? So the same thing, if you're not determining a security issue until weeks and weeks and weeks after it was introduced in the project or in the work, you've got a ton of stuff to unwind. But if I can sit there and I can sort of look to that, so what's been, you know, especially thinking from a product perspective, because I'm curious too, as I come from that ops thing where, you know, getting your product owner to understand the operational things that matter. It's like speaking the right language. Like, what are some things that security folks can do to get stuff prioritized, maybe?
Yeah, I have a good story on this. I think it actually does illustrate the shift left as well. So like you would see it all the time at TripAdvisor where a new engineer would, hire somebody out of college, or they came out of our internship program and they'd start. And as a product manager, it's day one, you want to give them something easy, some one day LOE kind of project. You're like, hey, implement like a photo, put a photo on this page, you know, and they would go in, and they'd be like, okay, well, like maybe it'll be a photo carousel. And what do they do, right? They're like college kids say, NPM install photo carousel or whatever they're going to do, right? And it gets to code review, right? And that's the junior dev, and then the senior engineer's like, yo, this is like TripAdvisor's core technology stack, and you're just adding a new library, and you don't know what's in it, and you don't know what's doing. Like, you can't do that. But then the junior dev, reasonably so, is like, well, what do you want me to do? Like, write a photo carousel from scratch, and like, so and then they have that conversation, and okay, we have a carousel library. Here's how you would repurpose it. This one's kind of blessed and good. And so, it kind of goes all the way back to that code review. And like Seth was talking about, that culture of, that security baked into the culture. And the code review, the senior dev's going to say, this is an insecure way of handling new features, but we do have high velocity and a good way and a prescribed way to do it. You just are not aware of it. So you can go do it this way and still hit your one day LOE. So I do think that, like, this one to me is like, as a business owner and a product owner, I care the most about these new features. So I'm gonna, show the business value and improve the customer experience. But there are ways of setting up your system in a way that, any new library, any new open source tool or project that you're going to use, have a policy, have a process for bringing those in, because you have to use them. You won't be competitive if you don't use them, but have a policy and a process for how you'd get new features over. So Martin, I'm curious from the security point of view how that resonates. But
yeah, it does. And I have to say that at a time when I was working at an organization where they were wanting to get to continuous delivery, so this is sort of in the very early days of Docker, we re-architected the way that the whole dev cycle worked in order to facilitate rapid momentum, but also a handle on what we were shipping to production. And we were using microservices to do that, putting feature flags in what was the monolithic application, APIs in what was a monolithic application that I'd inherited to talk to these containers. And by controlling that container infrastructure, architecture, and platform, we were able to move quickly with confidence. But what the tooling that we didn't have back then, that I would have given my right arm for, is the sort of stuff that we were talking about earlier. The ability to generate SBOMs as part of your CI process, the ability to understand your vulnerability exposure in all of your containers, and see that moving and trending over time. This is stuff, is manna from heaven. I would have loved to have had access to that kind of stuff, 10 years ago.
And I think the last thing I would think about having that process, but make sure it's sustainable. I had customers a few years ago who, were just dipping their toe into having anything open source. And the requirement was that the CIO had to approve every single open source library that might be used. They quickly realized that was insurmountable because of dependencies and packages and stuff. And so they were being like, okay, you're going to go through 15,000, so set things to be reasonable is just always a good thing.
Balance.
So I think we're coming up to the end. A couple things, like it'd be great to if we got follow-up things, we'll chat in the Discord for sure. You can find me on the LinkedIn's if that's a thing you do. I'm still on the Twitters, I guess. You can find me on Mastodon somewhere. Would love to talk more about this stuff and what we got coming up. We got something next week, right?
Yes, we do. So our next session is going to be this coming Tuesday, the 10th, same time, 1 o'clock Eastern. We're going to be discussing kind of the security landscape, market factors and different pressures that are coming from legislation, potentially from your customers, and some of the stats coming out of our container report that was recently presented last year. We're going to show kind of what's happened a few months on from that, and you'll see the development of, are containers getting any safer, what's going on. But just wrapping up this session, just want to say thank you to everyone for your participation. And a reminder that right now, all of Slim's vulnerability scanning and container intelligence features are free to use. So please take advantage of our beta period and try those out for free while you can. They're all at Slim.AI. And please join us in our Discord as well. I put the link into the chat. And thank you to all of our presenters today.
And everybody who said they love Chicago, we've announced the dates for DevOps Day Chicago, August 9th and 10th. So the CFP will be open soon. Registration. Come have some tavern style pizza with me.
Amazing. Sounds good. And Slim.AI sponsor as well. So,
nice.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Really appreciate it. We'll see you on Tuesday.
Yeah.
Thank you.